It's a pretty well-known fact that the lawlessness and wildness of the Old West has been greatly exaggerated for dramatic effect in works of fiction. The reality, of course, is that while there was an element of lawlessness to it, it was a frontier, and people who could not fit into society for various reasons did often go to the frontier country because that's where they could not be locked up or shot for their extremely antisocial behavior. The reality, of course, is that, like I said, for the most part, the Wild West was not nearly as wild as people make it out to be. The Indian Territory was not as dangerous as people made it out to be. Lewis and Clark crossed the entirety of it and then back again without any major incident. For example, the French trappers had been going there for well over a century before, the homesteaders and settlers and pioneers started crossing it. Now, of course, the homesteaders and settlers and pioneers represented, in a way, a much more meaningful threat to the Indians' way of life, and I think the Indians knew that, and so they reacted more violently to the appearance of homesteaders, settlers, and pioneers than they did to random passing explorers or trappers who were relatively low threat and were more a point of curiosity than anything else. So in reality, and of course, the wild animals were also not as dangerous as they are often made out to be. It's a little bit funny that the most dangerous animal in Red Dead Online is the cougar, of course, and cougar attacks on grown adult men, or women either for that matter, are almost completely unknown. They hardly ever happen, and if they do, it's such a bizarre circumstance behind it that it really can't be extrapolated into anything. Now, that's not to say that they wouldn't be dangerous, certainly to livestock or to children or something like that, but the idea that a cougar would attack a man on horseback and be a serious threat to him is kind of absurd. Similarly, wolves, I cannot believe how often I am attacked by wolves. And it's kind of curious. One of the things that I do is I typically make superior stew in my camp as soon as starting a session, and if I get kicked out or whatever other reason, I will often make it again. That goes through 3 big game meat to make that, and I could burn through that pretty quickly, except that I get attacked by wolves so often that I usually am carrying max or close to max big game meat on me. If for some reason it starts to run down, I know where I can go shoot a couple of gators and fill it back up again, but I really hardly ever need to do that because I get attacked by wolves so often. Now, there's a couple spots where I pretty routinely get attacked by cougars, so I know where they are. I'm sure that there's other places where grizzly bears or even black bears spawn with some frequency, but the reality is the black bears almost always run away from you. They don't ever try to attack you, and grizzly bears do, but I don't see them nearly as often. So the wild animal threat is also greatly exaggerated. And it's it's true that, of course, there are rattlesnakes throughout much of the territory, but those also pop up with just ridiculously extreme frequency. And gators, for that matter, are not nearly as dangerous as people make them out to be. They can be dangerous, of course, but for one thing, relatively seldom are they as big as they are in game. For another thing, they're not nearly as common and really never have been. And for another thing, they're primarily fish and turtle eaters. They will eat other things, of course, but the idea of them actively hunting people who come by is kind of ridiculous. Anyway, it's not just, of course, the danger of the frontier that is exaggerated. Almost everything that we think we know about it is exaggerated, or even a deliberate and, in fact, malicious lie told to us for reasons that have to do with exploiting our culture and our society and its general niceness. one of the things that few people recognize is that within the Hodgenau line, which basically means Northern Europe, Northern and Central Europe, England, Germany, to a certain degree France, Scandinavia, and Northern Italy, Switzerland, the Netherlands, etc. That territory is what is within the Hodgenau line. And for a better part of 1,000 years, it was under a system of manorialism, which kind of broke up the clans and favored single-family nuclear families, and which discouraged outbreeding, so that extended family nepotism was greatly reduced, and people put their efforts into furthering the greater community rather than their extended family. And that is exactly why the cultures within the Hodgenau line have been financially and in many other ways more successful than cultures without it, because for literally generations that has happened for 1,000 years. The other thing that happened that was associated with that is that violent criminals were put to death with pretty extreme regularity, which literally changed the gene pool of the white man. And enough of the violent behavior, and enough of our behavior is genetic, but enough of the violent behaving individuals were killed at a relatively young age, put to death, or otherwise cast out of society and struggled to successfully pass on their genetics to anybody, that the gene pool changed. And that is really kind of the secret of the success of white people. And these lies that you hear about privilege are really kind of absurd. The reality, of course, is that white people have done more over the last several generations, at least 2 or 3, but realistically, even more than that, at taking care of minorities within their midst. Sadly, we have been told that in spite of that, we are actually the source of all their ills rather than their own behavior, in spite of the fact that we are giving them better than we reserve for our own people. They remain kind of ungrateful and demanding. This is also true of the Indians, and we are told, for example, that when Americans came to America, there was a massive genocide of the Indian nations. This is actually not at all true, and in fact, it's numerically absurd. There are estimates published here and there, although I don't know exactly what they're based on. And I've read some of the papers, and it seems like that there are some really, really bad assumptions being made about the population of North America, north of the Rio Grande in particular, before the arrival of white men. And they just have, tens of millions, 10 million, 20 million. These estimates are frankly kind of absurd. There was a relatively large population south of the Rio Grande. There were large nations with full-blown civilizations and agriculture and, relatively large populations. And what we see, of course, is that the populations of those areas today remain or retain even today a relatively large Indian genetic component. The Mexicans, for example, are fairly Indian in genetic disposition. And of course there's an overlay of Spaniard that came and kind of were and remain even to this day a kind of upper class over the Indians. But that is not really true in North America. In North America, the Indians are either just assimilated into the general population and at a low level, or they remain in their reservations. And even then, people who claim to have Indian descent are often lacking in a lot of Indian descent. My daughter-in-law, for example, is Chickasaw. She's blonde and blue-eyed and about as white as you can imagine, but her grandmother's on the tribal rolls, and she could be, if she bothered to fill out the paperwork to become so, and she can vote even now in tribal affairs because she's recognized as a member of the Chickasaw Nation. Her Chickasaw genetics, though, obviously she doesn't have a lot of them. And you can tell just by at a glance that she doesn't. And this is often what happened in North America. The idea that there were these vast people that were murdered, put to death, killed by white people is absurd. There were obviously wars with some of these Indian nations. There were very notoriously, for example, wars with both the Apache and the Comanche, further north with the Sioux, with the Cheyenne, with some other nations. But those were not wars in which, massive amounts of people were just slaughtered. They were wars that were kind of low-grade raiding, and then, relatively small units of cavalry would run at each other, and that's where a handful of battles happened. Of course, if you cherry-pick history, you can find a handful of massacres of, a few dozen people here and there. Although, for whatever reason, nobody ever talks about the massacres of white people by the Indians, and there were an awful lot of them as well. They're very well documented. Nobody really denies that they happened unless they simply don't know anything about it. And in our education system today, nobody bothers to tell you about them, and they aren't talked about. If there were, in fact, somewhere between 10 and 20 million people in North America prior to the arrival of the white man, that had to have been, first off, that had to have meant that they were more complex agricultural societies than people think they were. And that is possible. In fact, there's some good evidence that there were much more complex and much more advanced civilizations in North America than we give it credit for. However, by the time we arrived, they were long gone. And there could be various reasons for that. Wars with each other is a big part of it. The prevailing theory, if there were numbers like that, is that plagues swept through them on the eve of white man's arrival, probably sparked by the very first settlers, or not settlers, but the very first explorers kind of setting down and making contact, and then the plague kind of spreading well in advance of any contact and wiping out the nations that were further inland to the point where their numbers were decimated. And what our ancestors saw was actually just kind of the Mad Max post-apocalyptic remnants of what had once been there. So that's one possibility. However, the people who tell you that generally do not admit to the Indians having had complex agricultural societies. And the best research and knowledge that we can do suggests that in a hunting-gathering society, the carrying capacity of the continent could not possibly have been more than about 2 to 3 million people. Curiously, right now there are about 2.9 million people who claim to be Native American, and another somewhat less than 500,000 if you kind of extract the genetic evidence or genetic material out of people who do not claim to be Native American but do have some Native American descent. In reality, the numbers, if in fact the Native Americans, and again, I don't really like the word Native American at all. I know people say it a lot. I prefer to say Indian just because it's what people always used to say. Somebody that I listen to calls them Siberian Americans. I don't like to call them any type of Americans because they're not Americans. They're not part of the American nation, and they never have been. They have their own nations, and the American nation is a nation of British sprinkled with a handful of other Northern European colonists that was established on the eastern seaboard and spread westward from there. If you're not part of that group of people, if you're not descended from the colonists, in other words, you're not actually an American. You're something else. Now, for a long time, and everybody likes to talk about, the story of immigrants. The Americans were not immigrants. They were colonists. They built a nation, and then they spread from there, from a small nation on the eastern seaboard further west. They were not immigrants. They did not immigrate from anywhere. Now, obviously, their ancestry, of course, is elsewhere, the same as the ancestry of the Indians is elsewhere, in Siberia, largely. and kind of far, Eastern Asia, but not, Northeastern Asia. So I don't even like to call them. They're not native and they're not Americans. I don't like Siberian Americans, although I think it's kind of clever. I just don't like calling them Americans at all, because they're really not Americans. They weren't even granted citizenship until the 1900s for the most part, unless, of course, they married into the American nations, assimilated into the American nations, had half American children, who in turn had 3/4 American children, who in turn had 7/8 American children. And that's how a non-American can become an American. They don't, their descendants do, over time, because they have assimilated into American society. The Indians have not done that. Even today, they maintain fiercely independent, although not terribly successful in many ways, nations. And they have been granted by treaty lands that say, okay, you know what, we're going to let you keep these. We're not going to try and do anything with them. You can live here. You can run your nation the way that you prefer. We won't really get in your way so much, and et cetera, et cetera. And so they are not actually Americans. Well, they do have American citizenship, but they're not Americans, and they will become less and less Indian over time. The intermarriage rate is really quite high for Native Americans. It's over 50%, which means that the next generation of Indians are, on average, going to be slightly less than half Indian. And that's why people like Elizabeth Warren can claim to be Indian when obviously she's not Indian at all. Even if she does have an Indian ancestor, which seems to have been a lie, but even if she does, she's not an Indian. She's blonde, she's blue-eyed, she's as American as they come, even though her attitudes are fiercely and treasonously anti-American. But this is the point, I guess, is that if the carrying capacity of hunter-gatherers is 2 to 3 million, the population today is about 3 million who claim to be Native Americans, regardless of the fact that many of them have, partial American genetics. The Indians today cannot, in any reasonable fashion, claim to have been genocided. If there are millions of people saying, you genocided us, that should give you pause to kind of say, oh, then why are you here? Because in reality, there's probably as many of them now as there were at the time of our contact with them. If, in fact, there had been much larger, more complex, agricultural-based societies, we can't really credibly take any blame for having destroyed them. They were already gone by the time we showed up. And I do think that it is credible that there were some, although I don't know that they were necessarily here literally on the eve of our arrival either. Anyway, keep that in mind when you hear stuff about the Old West. For the most part, much of what we think we know is a deliberate lie. It's been told to us because it benefits somebody at our expense. Because, why do the Indians say this? Why would they say that they've been genocided when there's 3 million of them there, and there probably were 3 million of them when we showed up? Because it benefits them. If they can guilt us into giving them land, telling them that they can do whatever they want to with it, we can give them all these federal funds, we can give them all free college tuition, we can give them all this welfare, we can do all these things for it. They can basically extract money from us by demanding red geld. If you're familiar at all with the term Dane geld, the reality, of course, is that Americans pay red geld, we pay brown geld, we pay black geld. We pay our minorities for the privilege of being minorities. And it's really kind of absurd. But it explains why they do it, and why that there's this consistent narrative that we did something bad to them, even when it's absurd. It's especially absurd in the case of the Jews, who often also accuse us of being Nazis, when in reality, of course, we're the ones who went and bailed them out from whatever the Nazis were doing to them. So it's really kind of absurd for them to turn around and then blame us for being anti-Semitic when we went and saved their bacon from the Nazis. But they're not the only ones who do that. They're just probably the most blatant. But everybody does that, and the Indians do it too. So when you hear all this stuff about, the social realities of the Old West and, all these other problems that the minorities had and all the oppression, all the blah, 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 you should immediately start wondering who's telling you that and why. And you should do some of your own research, because the reality is much of the narrative that we have been told is a flat-out, blatant lie. It just simply is not true. And the reality, of course, of the Old West is that it wasn't necessarily always peaceful, but it was mostly peaceful pioneers, settlers, and homesteaders moving across a frontier to establish, lands as an inheritance for their children. And they weren't looking to take anything from anybody else. They weren't looking to cause trouble with anybody else. And trouble often came to them after they had already made peaceful agreements with whoever was around, that then they reneged on those, that they had those agreements reneged on them and had to kind of fight back. That is the reality of the Old West. And the further back in time where you get closer to it, the more our history, the more people who remember it, the more people who tell stories about it will actually tell you that, because they were there. They saw it firsthand, or they saw it secondhand because their parents and their generation saw it firsthand. So that's another reason why going back and looking at older Westerns, it is idealized in many ways, but it is also told by people who were a lot closer to the truth than people now.